days in the huge Chernobyl disaster.
6 days after the accident, despite radiation levels several thousand times higher than normal, authorities encourage people to participate in May Day celebrations, even in areas they know to be seriously contaminated.
I watched the May Day 1986 festivities with my own eyes. I was there and I witnessed it, the parade of death. It was a parade of death. Those were terrible deaths.
Disturbingly, all footage of May Day 1986 has now disappeared from the Ukrainian National Archives. All that remains are Igor Kostyn's photos.
Sherbitsky, the first secretary of the Ukraine, also went to the festivities with his family and his grandchildren. It's true that, in theory, that seemed very important to us, to avoid any panic. But had we known how much radioactivity was already in the air?
How many were contaminated during the festivities? Not a single study has yet been published. Cherbinsky, first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, later committed suicide. One week after the explosion, the exodus continues. The inhabitants of the city of Chernobyl, 7 kilometers from the plant, are evacuated. So are all the villages within a 30-kilometer radius around the plant. 130,000 people are moved, many of whom have already been dangerously contaminated. A 300,000-hectare area straddling the Ukraine and Belarusia is abruptly evacuated and isolated from the rest of the world. A vast region uprooted, an entire culture ripped from its land, a world wiped out in a few days' time by an invisible enemy.
It was worse than a war. Here you couldn't see the enemy. In a war, you see the cannons, the machine guns, the tanks. Here, you see nothing. The radiation is everywhere. It goes right through you. It gets into you, and you only start feeling the effects later, sometimes years later. It's terrifying.
Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud continues to drift over Europe. It floats over Bavaria and northern Italy. Radioactive cesium-137 and iodine-131 rain down on the south of France and Corsica. Crops and pastures are seriously contaminated. While French authorities deny its presence, the cloud reaches Great Britain and spreads into Greece. In Chernobyl, the level of radioactivity continues to climb. 6,000 tons of sand and boric acid have filled the hole. But underneath this gigantic plug, the white-hot magma continues to smolder. 10 days after the disaster, Gorbachev personally invites Hans Blix, director of the powerful International Atomic Energy Agency, to visit the site. He is the first expert and the first Westerner to visit Chernobyl.
What can you say on this occasion? Well, we have seen the site from the air, and we have seen that a little smoke is still coming up from the damaged plant.
There was a good deal of talk about the risk of a second explosion, and I remember that when we were in Moscow, actually, we had a friend, a relative of one of my experts, phoned him and said, well, you know, we hear rumors that the second reactor might also explode.
At the bottom of the reactor, 195 tons of nuclear fuel are still burning, giving off incredible heat that is gradually melting the sand. On the surface of the plug, cracks begin to appear.
Once we plugged up the hole, the temperature started to rise. We were afraid because it could have caused another explosion. It was terrifying. Scientists came to take readings. They were very worried. They were afraid the critical temperature would be reached and it would set off a second explosion. That would have been a terrible tragedy.
The cement slab below the reactor core is heating up and in danger of cracking. The magma is threatening to seep through. The water the firemen poured during the first hours of the disaster has pooled below the slab. If the radioactive magma makes contact with the water, it could set off a second explosion even more devastating than the first. The country's top experts are called into action. Vasily Nestorenko was one of them. At the time, he was working on improving the Soviet Union's intercontinental nuclear missiles.
If the heat managed to crack the cement slab, only 1,400 kilograms of uranium and graphite mixture would have needed to hit the water to set off a new explosion.
The ensuing chain reaction could set off an explosion comparable to a gigantic atomic bomb.
Our experts studied the possibility and concluded that the explosion would have had a force of 3 to 5 megatons. Minsk, which is 320 kilometers from Chernobyl, would have been razed and Europe rendered uninhabitable.
We had to stop the process. If it continued, it would have been an enormous disaster, an enormous nuclear disaster.
This second explosion would have been accompanied by a terrible shockwave and a massive rise in radioactivity that would have claimed thousands of lives in a matter of hours.
Thank God it didn't happen. There were trains with over 1,000 cars in Minsk, Gomel and Kiev ready to evacuate the population.
The situation is critical. In Moscow, the State Commission decrees 2 emergency measures. First, send in a battalion of firemen to drain the water from under the reactor. They will later be declared national heroes, but will suffer from radiation sickness the rest of their lives. Second, seal the breach more effectively to bring the temperature down once and for all. In 2 days, General Antochkin's men will drop 2,400 tons of lead into the reactor.
When we started dumping lead in, the temperature went down right away. It absorbed well and sealed the hole as it melted, so there was less radiation.
But some of this lead melts when it hits the blaze and vaporizes into the atmosphere. 20 years later, traces of it can be found in the sick children of Chernobyl.
It's highly criticized today.